Good morning. Thank you all for joining us this morning. I have 10:30 on my clock, so we'll get started in just a little bit. I wanted to make sure we had folks from the campaign on with us, so just giving them a couple minutes to log in. My name's Elena Wilkin. I'm the Executive Director of Housing Colorado, and we wanted to provide this forum this morning because there have been a lot of questions around the Gallagher amendment itself, and then what the repeal looks like. And I've attended, as I'm sure many of you have, a couple of the different sessions that have been put on around this, and really just felt like I haven't had a chance to have my specific questions that are sort of specifically related to how this repeal would affect housing affordability. And that was really, since that's obviously what we do, I thought let's just do a session just around this. So what we thought we'd do today to really give enough time to ask some pretty deep dive questions is allow the campaign to give us a brief sort of overview. I've kind of assumed that most of you know the general outline of the amendment. If you have other questions, obviously you are more than welcome to ask while they're doing the overview. And then we really thought we'd just open it up and do sort of a forum to ask specific questions for the folks that you work with in homeownership and in housing affordability, and also your own organizational questions. So we have been asked by the campaign, Housing Colorado has been asked to take a formal position of endorsement on this. So those of you who are on the legislative committee and the board will be asked following this session about whether or not we feel comfortable taking a position of support. So just to give you the punchline on today's session is where we're headed for this. So so I hope you all know how to manage the chat function. I will be monitoring that as we go forward. This is also a small enough group that I am very comfortable if folks just want to unmute themselves and ask questions also. So we really wanted this to be a free exchange of concerns and questions, and not feel like you were held back by the technology. So again, if you have a question, either throw it in the chat, and you're also welcome to unmute yourself and give a shout out. So so I guess we'll start with that. Does anyone have any specific questions, or if you want to put in the chat right now, the most burning thing that had you show up here at 10:30 on a Monday morning and talk about talk about a ballot amendment, you're welcome to do that. Otherwise, I will go ahead and turn it over to Josh and Chris. I don't know if you guys, who wants to get started?
Go ahead, Chris, all you.
All right, well, yeah, thanks, Josh, and very good morning. Thanks for having us. This is State Senator Chris Hansen. I was one of the sponsors of the repeal measure being sent to the ballot that received broad bipartisan support at the General Assembly to put the amendment in front of you on your ballot, which you should be receiving here in just about a week. Very pleased to be working with Josh Penry, Curtis Hubbard, the whole team on the campaign, and appreciate Housing Colorado making time for us this morning. I would like to urge you to support Amendment B. There are a number of reasons why I think this is a really important moment for us to get Gallagher out of the Constitution. I think first and foremost, we're in a fiscal situation which is pretty dire at the state level, and Gallagher amendment is putting additional pressure on state and local budgets at the very moment when we need to be able to deliver these important services to the state. And so want to have a chance to share that story a little bit with you this morning. But I also think we're fundamentally in a place where the Gallagher Amendment is not working for the state of Colorado anymore. It kind of made sense in 1982 when it went into the Constitution that we would fix the ratio of residential and non-residential property taxes, but we've now reached a position that is providing the funds for K-12, for the county health department, for fire districts, for hospital districts, all the important services that we rely on at a state and local level. There's a component that is directly tied to property tax. And so what the repeal is basically asking voters to do is to take that fixed statewide ratio out of the Constitution and freeze the residential assessment rate and the non-residential assessment rate where they are right now. And we're at 7.15 for residential assessment rate, 29% for non-residential, and repeal would just freeze those in statute. And the legislature could not increase those in the future because of Tabor. And so those would be frozen in place if we repeal Gallagher. And I think, that's really what we're asking for the state to move forward with. Colorado has what are virtually the lowest property taxes on the residential side in the country right now. Out of 53 taxing jurisdictions, we are 51st for residential rates. So obviously, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to pay any property tax, income tax, or sales tax? But of course, we need to have high quality schools. We need to have county health departments. We need to have fire protection. And we rely on a stable and sustainable property tax system to be able to deliver those services. And I think fundamentally that's what the Gallagher repeal is all about, is to stabilize that system, make sure we can deliver great services, and freeze those rates at their low level that they're at right now. And we think that's a very fair question to put in front of the voters. And with that, let me turn it over to Josh for other comments.
Thanks, Senator, for the comments. Thank you all for joining us on a Monday morning. I know these are busy times and it's a busy season. Appreciate your focus. I second Senator Hansen's request. We're hopeful to win the endorsement of Housing Colorado. Just sort of a word on process. I think it's interesting in talking to a lot of groups around the state with different priorities, different constituencies, different focuses. The one thing that I like to have been sort of starting off with, against the backdrop of all the noise and frankly the anarchy that feels like modern American politics, this is an amazing success story. The referral of this bill to the voters this fall, where you had about 75% of Republicans and Democrats in the legislature who took what is admittedly a very difficult issue, and one that is super complicated and hard to dig into, and it would be easy to sort of duck and referred what is like a bold and common sense reform. And he did it in an election year. And I think that's certainly a testament to Chris, but it's a testament to a lot of people in the legislature, the handful of Republicans and Democrats who sponsored it, but in the end, a number of people who voted for it. And I will say, in this day and age, when gridlock is everywhere, like that's an end unto itself. That's not the deal closer, but I think it's worth acknowledging, like we need more responsible leadership in this state. And one of the reasons I'm personally so hopeful we get this done is we reward the good behavior. We can get on to the next big issue challenging the state next year and into the future. And also want to congratulate Chris for his leadership. So, he made the case, like, the Gallagher amendment is broken. It's shifting resources. It's creating irrational outcomes. It's ultimately hammering small business in ways that, as the NFIP says, will inevitably push local businesses sort of to across the line of insolvency at a time they're struggling enough. But it also, is forcing these irrational shifts that hurt these basic local services, police, fire, local funding for our school districts. All those things get moved around once the Gallagher formula works its magic, or I guess whatever the antithesis of magic is. And it's really causing problems, really desperate problems for those basic social services. But B is like it is a balanced approach for the reasons that Senator Hansen said. We have the third lowest property tax rates in the country, and we're lock them in at that level. There were some people who have said, well, we should increase property taxes on homeowners, and other people say, well, we should increase property taxes on business. And the truth is, right now, it would be pretty difficult and maybe even a little irresponsible to think about doing either, because everybody is struggling in these economic conditions. And so there is a basic justice to, like, we're freezing rates, we're creating stability across the board for both homeowners and for small business, and we're getting rid of these sort of irrational shifts that are dogging both small businesses and certainly those basic services that we spoke of. When and if this thing passes, I think Colorado homeowners will still very much feel like they've got low property taxes. And the last point I would make is, and from the perspective of affordable housing, how Gallagher is the beginning of the conversation, not the end. When the Gallagher shift happens, as many of you know, fire districts, school districts, irrigation districts, library districts, once Gallagher does its shift, those districts where they've lost revenue consistently and frequently have no choice but to go back to the voters and ask for tax increases. So any savings in the end, as you look at how this thing has evolved over the last few years, the homeowners turns out to be de minimis, because you have sort of this death by 1,000 paper cut strategy where districts have to go back and ask for tax increases. There's a number of districts that have these automatic mill levy increases that when Gallagher does its thing, automatically there's a backfill that happens where homeowners pay more and then small businesses pay at that four times ratio. And so in the end, from an affordable housing perspective, homeowners really don't benefit. What really frankly saves homeowners from increased property taxes is Tabor. I know there's probably folks who don't love Tabor on this, or probably some folks who like Tabor. The reality is, like, these are two very separate issues, and the fact that those mill levy increases will still have to go to the people is what we think ultimately protects homeowners from increased property taxes. So, I guess maybe one other thing, the carrying cost, there's lots of unintended consequences in Gallagher. One of them is that, in terms of the impact on affordable housing, if you have vacant land, you pay at that 29% rate, so your carrying costs are higher. And so when you transition to housing as a piece of vacant land to a housing development or to an apartment complex, those carrying costs are higher because it's taxed at that higher rate. So there's all kinds of unintended consequences. That one is specifically pertinent because it hurts the cause, of affordable housing in a very pertinent way. So with that, I think we've probably said all that there is needed to say. As Senator Hansen said at the outset, we'd be very, very grateful for your organization's support.
Thank you so much. That was a helpful overview just to orient us where we are on that issue. I wonder if I could kick off with a question that folks have been asking me, and that is, Josh, you mentioned that this is just the start of the conversation. And so my understanding is, as you said, there are plans for subsequent either legislation or other things to kind of work on perhaps, low income folks on, a gradated tax assessment rate, or, can you kind of give us a sense of what maybe you guys are thinking about if this does pass, what happens after this?
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. I think there is a strong desire to improve our property tax system in the state. We've got right now the Gallagher Amendment forces a statewide ratio, which disproportionately hurts rural areas and suburban areas. And thank you for bringing up, the ability post repeal, we then have an opportunity to go back and look at ways to help specific parts of the housing market. Right now we have the senior homestead exemption, which frankly is not well structured. It's not portable. Most of the benefit is ending up with people who really don't need it. It's not a very wise tax expenditure in my estimation right now. I think we'd be much better off, helping folks who really need the help. And so after we get rid of Gallagher, we're in the position with it out of the Constitution to then have a really robust reform conversation at the legislature. And I certainly, I'm pushing for repeal so that we can start that in January. And I can see a number of different ways that we could do more for, low income and affordable housing, and use our tax expenditure and get more bang for that buck, so to speak.
Yeah, one of the problems with Gallagher is, to Senator Hansen's point, is it's sort of like, it is definitely one size fits all in terms of the ratio, but it's also one size fits all in terms of the tax cuts it hands out. So if you look at the bulk of the tax savings, if next year, if there's a tax cut, the bulk of the tax benefit goes to, high-end homeowners in our wealthiest neighborhoods. It goes to second homeowners, in resort towns, many of them don't even live in Colorado. And so literally you have hundreds of millions of dollars being taken away from police, from fires, from local schools to fund tax cuts there. Meanwhile, once the Gallagher shift happens, as I said earlier, fire districts, school districts, library districts, irrigation districts, and on are forced to go back to the people who actually live in their communities and increase taxes. And so the actual it's funny, I hear, a lot of people say, I don't remember my property tax bill ever going down because of Gallagher. It's a curious thing. And that's partially because these districts are clawing back. So those kind of massive wholesale inequities in the system are definitely things that the legislature could address in the future. Like a really critical point though is the legislature can't increase the rates. It can only be sort of a downward movement. And that's you know, once this is repealed, and I think that's a positive thing, but I definitely think those things are worth looking at. This is a vastly, people say, well, it's perfect. You have to take the next step. And, you know, why don't you just wait until you take, you know, down the road, let's kick it, you know, kick this can down the road. And the truth is, if we don't pass Gallagher this year, small businesses will see about $300 million in these automatic local property tax increases. Fire districts, school districts, these other districts will see cuts. And so that is why there is urgency, and that is why repealing Gallagher today and freezing rates where they are is a dramatic improvement, even if there is, you know, some future conversation down the road.
Okay, so we got a question in the chat about who benefits and who loses, and I think you've touched on that. I wonder if you guys don't mind just doing one more time, and I know you can do this in your sleep, but what is it about Tabor that forces the rate to go down in debt? Like, why is it that we're looking at a cut in 2021? And what I've heard is down to like 5.8% if the repeal doesn't pass. Can you just walk through the mechanics of that one more time so we can all be on the same page?
Yeah, happy to do that. So yeah, the expectation is that we would see a 20% reduction in the residential assessment rate. We're at 7.15. It's likely to end up somewhere between 5.8 and 5.9 if the estimates hold. And essentially what's happening is we're getting a little bit of a scissor effect here. COVID is pushing down on the value of non-residential properties right now. Think of, you know, the retail space in your community. It's worth a lot less this year than it was a year ago. And then simultaneously, we've got residential values that are stable or going up. And so think of what's happening in Vail and Aspen right now. You've got New Yorkers coming in and bidding up the price of every property in the mountains because they want, you know, a place to escape from the city. And so property values in the resorts communities are going way up. Denver's still seeing a lot of pressure in the metro market, and property values stable or going up. And so those two things happening simultaneously mean that the ratio of total value in the market is dropping on non-residential side and going up on the residential side. And Gallagher is forcing what is essentially a 20% cut to the residential assessment rate. So that's the mechanics of what's happening and the way that Gallagher interacts with those changes in values. And typically commercial and residential have tracked each other, but not this year. We are in kind of this black swan situation where they are diverging, and that is a very rare thing in the market. And so that's, you know, that's what we're up against. And the other thing I would say is that if you look at the history, since Tabor and Gallagher have both been in place since the early 90s, there were 8 years where the residential assessment rate actually should have gone up and to adjust to the economic reality, but because of Tabor, it could not. So it's a one-way ratchet down, which means that we basically have you know, erosion year after year after year of our property tax system, and now we're kind of to that point of the fiscal cliff, so to speak, where it is going to cause massive harmful consequences.
The one point I would add that it really does, I think, frame it for me, it's because it is so complicated, is, you know, business and the property owners in business on the commercial side of things, they've got to pay 55% no matter what. Today, when you take 55% of all the property tax it collects has got to come from business, from local business and on the commercial side. Today, about 20% of all the property value in the state is from businesses, commercial property. So that means 20% of the property value has to pay 55% of the tax. And that triggers all kinds of shifting. The first thing it does, like, how does 20% pay 55%? They just got to pay a lot. And so that's why you see Colorado has really low property taxes for homeowners. That's a good thing, but we're really high for local businesses. And if this shift happens again, they're going to get about $300 million more next year amid COVID and the closures and the shutdown. And so it does a really critical part of this. I mean, you know, I come from the Republican side of the aisle, Senator Hansen's from the Democratic side of the aisle. There's this awesome confluence of people who are coming on board. Some people because it's destroying services that are important. Other people because this is just so devastating and harmful big businesses. The big businesses could, property taxes are like, a drop in the bucket of their overall of how their businesses function. For small businesses, incremental property tax increases of 6, 8, 10, 12% are going to be the difference between life and death. And so that's why you see this coalition that's coming together. 20% of taxpayers saying we just can't do anymore. And that is the simple elegance. We're just freezing it, right? And we're not going to homeowners and saying we need you to pay a property tax increase. And unfortunately, from a business perspective, we can't do anything to improve it, but at least we're giving kind of stability and consistency to both sides of the aisle on the go forward, and we're ending kind of these irrational shifts.
All right, I'm gonna let other folks jump in if you have a question. Because I'll keep asking if you don't ask yours. I'll just keep going. So I have a question about where this lands in our legislative structure. Is this a constitutional change or is this a statutory change?
Yeah, it's an amendment. So it is an amendment to our Constitution. The ballot language that you see is essentially a straight repeal of the Gallagher Amendment that was put in 1982. We did a straight repeal because that amendment went in with a 50% bar. It can come out with a 50% bar. So that's why Amendment B is just a straight repeal, and it just needs 50% plus one.
So does it actually write the new rates in the Constitution itself, or does it just say the rates are frozen at whatever they are at the end of 2020?
Yeah, so we actually did a companion piece of legislation, Senate Bill 223, which basically says if the Gallagher Amendment is repealed, the rates are frozen where they are today. So that's it. It then becomes a creature of statute, and it comes out of our Constitution.
The one other consideration there is you still have Tabor on the books, and Tabor says you can't increase that rate. Yep. So to the extent that additional reforms per your earlier question wanted to happen, they could only go down. If at any point, folks want to increase property taxes, whether at the state level or at the local level, they have to ask for a vote, for a vote of the people, be a vote of the people.
Okay, thank you for that. Also wanted to know what other groups have been able to endorse this.
Yeah, Josh, you got the probably latest list.
Yeah, it's hundreds, might be a slight exaggeration, although it doesn't really feel like it. The kind of preeminent organizations on the left, the right, and the middle are on board, from the business and agriculture perspective, National Federation of Independent Business, Chambers of Commerce, and Loveland and Greeley and Grand Junction and Denver and Boulder and on and on and on, Club 20, Action 22. The Colorado Women's Forum, our Colorado Women's Chamber of Commerce, Colorado Forum, more progressive groups, Colorado Education Association, AFL-CIO, NAACP, another number of organizations like that, groups that are kind of civic-minded in the center across the board. So it is law enforcement, the Chiefs Association, the Fire Chiefs Association, and then the line officers, the rank and file, and the chiefs, the Fraternal Order of Police, Hank Brown, the former U.S. Senator from Colorado, who authored the Balanced Budget Amendment and was president of CU, generally regarded as a fiscal conservative, Ken Salazar, Wellington Webb. It's just like Gallagher just doesn't work. And so it's funny, people kind of, for very different sets of reasons, are all coming together behind it. So it's a massive and really impressive coalition that's behind it.
And how are we polling? How does it look in the polls? If you guys been able to do some in the field work? Yeah,
this is a black box, as this conversation has illustrated. It's complicated for folks who want to get in the weeds, but we feel like we have a fighting chance. We have a wonderful coalition of groups. As I said, we have funders from across the spectrum. We're running a real campaign. Our political argument to the voters, it has to be much simpler than the one we're able to sort of go into greater depth on today. And Gallagher's broken. It's penalizing small businesses with taxes at 4 to 5 times higher than everybody else. And it's decimating these vital local services that we all need: police, fire, teachers, basic social safety net services like investments for the developmentally disabled. So some of you probably have started to see our advertising it's getting out there in the community more, and you'll be seeing a lot more of it in the coming days and weeks. Our job is to convert people. So people start off with no clue. Gallagher Amendment, what? And nobody knows. Very few people really know. And so our education gap is kind of the big challenge. One, two, it's a busy year, so there's a lot going on. So breaking through with positive storytelling is kind of our challenge. I do think the last thing I'd say, and then Senator Hansen, you should speak to it, is people are hungry for bipartisanship. So the fact that we have Republicans and Democrats working together, we have groups on the right and the left working together, is also a really important tiebreaker for a lot of voters who, they may not be totally firm on the facts, but the fact that everybody's kind of on board really does seem to matter.
Yeah, I would just quickly add, I kind of have described this to people as like, if this was a football field, we are playing between the 10-yard lines here. We have a very broad coalition from the left, from the right. I mean, how many issues do we get agreement from NFIB, Colorado Concern, and the CEA? It's a pretty short list. We had 75, of the 100 legislators support this, more, way over the 2/3 that we needed in the legislature to refer it. That's the kind of consensus that we're seeing on this. And I think to Josh's point, it's our challenge now to communicate to the voters in a simple to understand way of why they should care about this and why now is the time to move the repeal. And that's tough. If we spend 3 minutes trying to talk about the intricacies of property tax, we know we're going to fail. We've really been focusing on communicating with people about, hey, do you want to make sure we've got stable funding for schools, fire districts, et cetera? That's really been what we've been trying to communicate. And I think we've made some great headway with that approach.
Thanks. That's super helpful. So another question kind of about the mechanics around this. So in a state that doesn't have sort of these weird ratchet, taper, blah, 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 is it safe to say that in general, you just rely on rising property values to increase property tax revenue to cover the cost of infrastructure, wire? I mean, is that how this particular tax mechanism is supposed to work?
Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, well,
I'm happy to.
Yeah, sorry, I was quickly reading the chat too that came in with some other questions. So I apologize. I got distracted there for one second.
Okay.
While you were...
So the question is, I guess, so is it typical in most states that don't have these kind of weird machinations that you just rely on rising property values and you keep your property taxes about the same every year to cover the cost of increasing the cost of providing services in fire and water and libraries and things like that? Or do most states see an increase in property taxes in the actual rate itself year over year?
Yeah, most states, it's a little bit hard to compare, I think, but because of everything else happening in side by side with property tax rates. And of course, here we're talking about the assessment rate. So how much of the value the county assessor finds is actually taxable. And then of course the mill levy rate applies to that amount of valuation. So it's, kind of several step process here. And you see wide variation across the state and across the country and how that's handled. I would say, Colorado has for 4 decades now relied on the general fund to backfill any shortages caused by Gallagher. Mm-hmm. Folks, those days are over. The general cannot continue to do that. We have shifted from local to state support on K-12 from 60% to 40%. And that can't continue. We can't go to 30 or 20% local support for schools. The state general fund, which is basically income tax and sales tax, simply can't bear that responsibility. And so I think partly what we're trying to sell here is that we need a balance between property sales and income tax to be able to deliver the services the state requires. And if we leave Gallagher in place, we're obviously going to impinge on one leg of that 3-legged stool. And what I would say, with my kind of JBC and state budget hat on, there just is no resource available for any additional backfill at this point, which is what makes this so urgent that we get it done on this ballot.
And just one point too, and I think it's a great set of comments on the simple question about rising property values. The answer is yes, sort of. It's important to remember that, say you have a $400,000 home, and in the last 2 years it's increased in value by $100,000. and it's $500,000. You don't pay tax on the $100,000. You pay tax on 7,000 of that $100,000. And so there's a massive discount because of the shifting that occurred over the last 40 years that will significantly cushion the blow of any increase in the cost of housing. So that to me is a really important consideration. So yes, on some level, the property values will go up, or taxes will go up, values go up. Here's the kicker. Even with Gallagher, as to your own, think about your own personal finances and the comment I made ago, like have your property taxes gone down? The truth is, even when Gallagher does its thing, these districts that rely on property taxes to provide ambulance services, they're not cutting an ambulance, or the fire station's not shutting down a fire station. They're going back and asking for a tax increase at the local level. And so you're really getting a one by one. It's interesting as you look at the revenue rebound, all these districts are clawing back their money. So at the end of the day, homeowners are benefiting, only nominally and in the very short run from Gallagher's shift. That's point one. Point two, and this is the really insidious and destructive part of Gallagher. Gallagher requires local property taxes to be at that ratio. So let's say you have a fire district that wants to build a fire station and it costs $2 million. Gallagher requires that 4-to-1 split, soon to be 5-to-1 split. So that local community has to tax farmers and manufacturers and small businesses and restaurants and shops at that 4-to-1 ratio. And so who's the big loser in this? Really the loser are local businesses. They're just more and more and more shift every 2 years, every 4 years, every 6 years, mill by mill by mill on their backs. And so it's really creating a situation of where it's threatening Colorado's competitiveness. And to sort of square the circle, at the end of the day, homeowners really aren't benefiting a whole heck of a lot anyway.
Great, thank you. You're right, this is complicated. Another question coming in. Brian, I hope that answered your question because that was yours. So I hope I got it out there right. So this is actually from one of our board members. So she asks, and I think this again has to do with the mechanics of putting these things through our complicated legislative process, is the opportunity to add protections for low-income homeowners who may be negatively impacted by the repeal of Gallagher because property taxes are rising in areas where home prices are just skyrocketing. Is that attached to would that be attached to the companion legislation you were talking about that'll freeze the assessment rate, or is that something subsequent that we would work on starting in January?
Yeah, that would be a subsequent conversation. So what we passed last session was Senate Bill 223. That was almost 100% vote on that in support. That freezes the rates where they are if Gallagher is repealed. We then would need to come back in January with groups like Housing Colorado and start to work through what the options would be for property tax relief for particular segments or reform of the system. So that's a subsequent conversation. I think there's a lot of interest and appetite to do that, but until we get Gallagher out of the Constitution, we're stuck.
Well, the one thing I would add to that, I think is germane to Senator Hansen's point a minute ago about funding from the general fund. There are, for affordable housing programs in the general fund. I'm not on the budget committee, but I think I'm probably not going out on a limb to say those types of discretionary programs have a huge bullseye on them. If you have to, with everything that's happened with the recession and slowdown in the economy, there's going to be a hit to revenue. If the legislature has to backfill $500 million in local K-12 funding, which it probably will if Gallagher's not repealed, then all of those discretionary programs, including the programs for first-time home buyers, affordable housing subsidies, all those types of things in the general fund themselves have a massive bullseye on them. So, as you sort of weigh out the portfolio of things, I think there are definitely programs that are not likely to survive all the cost shifts of Gallagher, especially in the age of COVID.
Yep. Okay, so now you've got my folks thinking. This is great. So now we have some conversation around how you tier those property taxes. So I think, like you said, this is not an issue that folks have really contemplated before, but perhaps the opportunity to have a primary residential rate and then a rate also for second and third homeowners. and then a separate rate for commercial, obviously. So are those the kind of ideas you guys are thinking about?
Yeah, 100%. And I'll take it a step further. Every single one of those ideas would definitely be on the table. I would add to it that we probably are going to need something around for rent units as well, and how the state is going to handle VRBO, Airbnb versus commercial hotels and motels. Right, there's a bunch of sub issues there that need attention, and I would say this gives us a whole set of tools we've never had before if we get Gallagher out of the Constitution. And I would say simultaneously, and just speaking for myself, I think we have to do some reform measures on the senior homestead exemption as well, because it's not working well for the state. So that would all go into the mix when we come back in January if we can get Gallagher out of the Constitution.
And it's safe
some
to
sort
say
of means test, and some sort of means test too. I mean, if you look at who this yawning, expanding gap between the haves and have-nots. I'm a Republican. I believe in free enterprise, but this is it's a major problem. And this is one of those. I mean, you think about who benefits from Gallagher. If you are a publicly traded company that's building high-rise apartments in downtown Denver, you are killing it because of the Gallagher Amendment to the tunes of tens and tens of millions of dollars. Now, think about what you could do if we repeal Gallagher with that chunk of change to provide, relief to people, in the sort of trying to qualify for conventional loan or trying to stay in their house. I mean, there's all kinds of opportunities. Because of the craziness of our Constitution, though, really the essential first step is to get Gallagher gone first, so that those steps can be taken.
And it is, what I'm hearing from you is that we can't do any of that with Gallagher in place. Like Gallagher just kind of locks everything into this formula without any other sort of tools in our property taxing toolbox.
Yeah, I think that's the simplest way to understand it. We're really stuck until we can get this out of the Constitution, and then we've got lots of different directions we can evaluate at the legislature, and obviously working with groups like Housing Colorado to do that when we come back in January.
Super exciting. Okay. Well, I want to hand it to you guys. You are masters at the chat. This is great. But also you should feel free to just unmute yourself if you want to ask a question with your real voice and face too. So I might be watching some of your questions. Anything else that folks are, oh, I have another question for you. And this has nothing to do with affordable housing, but I have kind of perused the No website just to kind of see what you guys were up against. And the contention that this really benefits big business. I know you touched on this. I think it was Chris, or maybe it was Josh, that for larger businesses, property taxes is not that big of a deal for them. Do you think this would end up benefiting larger businesses?
The majority of businesses in Colorado are small business. More than 1 million Coloradans every day wake up and go to work working for a small business. And that's actually 2-year-old numbers, and it's actually expanded from there. So, it disproportionately benefits or hurts local businesses. Obviously, the big businesses, medium businesses, all businesses pay property tax rates, but the same can be true, I've said, and it's more pointed on the other side, where if you look at who benefits from Gallagher as it is now, it's higher end homeowners benefit significantly. And then it's, apartments are treated as residential. So these big sort of the conglomerates that manage, the largest apartment complex, they benefit disproportionately too. So the motivation, honestly, and people are really sympathetic to this. I think more so now than ever. You see your local restaurant that you love to frequent is gone. I mean, it's happening all more. The shop that you went to, the Main Street establishment are really under threat. I think the impact to small business is part of what's galvanized a larger coalition to say this just isn't the right approach. I do think on the other side, put a flower shop in Alamosa that's, worth, a couple $100,000, pay the same rate as, the dude who owns the 80-story, 70-story building in downtown Denver. It seems to me there should be some differentiation. Gallagher traps in this one-size-fits-all mindset, and by getting rid of it, we can begin to do some of that sorting that makes our tax code more intelligent and fairer across the spectrum of payers. So
now you've really got them thinking. So the next question is, how does how does repealing Gallagher fit into sort of the larger, either repealing or undoing pieces of Tabor conversation?
It's a different debate.
I should probably take this one, huh, Josh?
Go for it. Go for it.
As a committed opponent of Tabor and what it's doing to our state, I'd be happy to take this one. Look, Gallagher is extra bad because of Tabor, as we talked about. What does it do for the larger conversation about taking Tabor out? I mean, you saw a group on the left trying to do that this year with 271. They were not successful in getting on the ballot. You know, there's clearly no bipartisan consensus in the legislature to refer a measure. So just to be clear, there was no path to refer something to the voters from the legislature to change Tabor. I am of the opinion that you know, the state of Colorado can basically manage the biggest negative impacts of Tabor over time, as we have done in the state legislature. You know, Ref C was obviously a huge important step. You know, we don't have to worry about the Tabor cap this year, that's for sure. So we've got time and tools to go after the other parts of Tabor that I think are damaging the state. What I would say, though, is that if we can't stabilize property tax, we are basically going to push more and more responsibility onto the general fund, and that makes the negative impacts of Tabor that much more pernicious. So, you know, these things are related. They are tied together. If we can get Gallagher out, we get rid of some of the immediate downsides of Tabor, and that allows us then time and distance to be able to manage the other downsides, in my opinion. So, you know, I hear people have said to me, like, you know, at East Denver Democratic meetings, well, why didn't you just go after Tabor instead? I'm like, hey, that would be great. You know, I would like a pony and a unicorn too, and some cotton candy. Like that's all fantastic, and I obviously support that as a policy outcome. But you know, this is what is possible right now. This is the positive step we can take to constitutional reform right now. Let's not let perfect be the enemy of the good, depending on how you feel about other parts of the Constitution. Let's get this done.
Yeah, and it's interesting. This was what's so cool about this coalition, and why I'm actually like honored to be part of the conversation. You know, there was a time in our politics where we could disagree on important things and work together on important things, literally at the same time. Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan typified it, and it's like the story of America for a couple hundred years. And that's what we have to get back to. And this Tabor debate is really interesting because it's case in point. You have major coalition partners on both sides of this effort to get rid of B. You have some people who are avowed critics of Tabor and want it gone next. Then you have other people who are avowed supporters of Tabor, like Hank Brown, who I didn't actually realize. He said, I campaigned for Tabor 3 times. And so, but they are really separate issues. They're very separate issues because there is a very discrete impact that Gallagher is happening. It's just irrational. You can argue, should voters vote on tax increases or not, in a fairly kind of black and white way, or should we, you know, all the ramification of Tabor. These irrational shifts, you know, you just essentially have an old formula that doesn't make any sense anymore in Gallagher that's wreaking havoc. That's brought together a totally different coalition of people who just disagree on some of these other questions. One of the things we're trying to do is court people on both sides and say, look, we'll have that fight another day. In the meantime, we've all got to work together to get rid of Gallagher because it's hurting taxpayers and it's hurting the services we all value.
Well, Jennifer says thank you. That's very helpful. So any other questions for Chris and Josh? Either typed or spoken? All right. Hey, I really want to thank you guys both for being with us this morning, but also just tackling this incredibly interesting and complicated issue. And you know, personally as a Coloradan, I was thrilled to see this come out of the legislature, as you say, because of the bipartisan, but also just the ability to kind of hone in on something that's specifically difficult for our communities, and really building this coalition and putting this issue out there and trusting the Colorado voters to be intelligent enough to be able to wade through this and really think about the consequences. So I think our next steps as an organization is, like I said, we're going to go back to our board and our legislative committee and ask them, you know, their position. Those of you who do not serve on either one of those, please feel free to either email me or your friendly board member if you have other questions or have an idea for Housing Colorado, we always are really happy to hear what's going on in your communities and how this impacts you. And then we will take an electronic vote on this. So just really want to thank you, gentlemen, for coming with us this morning, and for all of those of you who joined us for this enlightening conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.